The revelation we are about to talk about is highly overwhelming and very offensive. It will hurt your feelings badly, but in the end, you will be relieved that you heard the truth than have never heard it at all. Please be advised.
So far we have learnt that Yahweh is angry at us for disobeying His commandments. The reason for our lives being really tough is based on 3 points. Number 1, the curses written in Deuteronomy 28. Number 2, idolatry or false gods, the spirits we and our ancestors who lived before us abandoned Yahweh for, bring pain and suffering into our lives so that we give them blood or animal sacrifices, which keep us cursed and cut off from Yahweh. This has been a continuous cycle since the day our ancestors who lived before us decided to stop worshiping Yahweh and start worshiping ancestral spirits. Number 3, all sorts of witchcraft. Looking at the information provided by the Arianasi research website, it says here that Hebrews or Israelites migrated into Africa in many different phases throughout history, and the descendants of the transatlantic slave trade in the Western Hemisphere possessed the same DNA as the DNA found in the Egyptian Hyksos mummies by way of West Africa, this DNA being the E1B1A DNA. According to the Zondervan Compact Bible Dictionary, Hyksos are defined as a West Semitic people who ruled an empire embracing Syria and Palestine, called the Shepherd Kings by the Egyptian historian Manetho. Continuing onwards, West Africa was the location of many marine shipping ports which served as the docks to transport these Israelite descendants from West Africa into the world. Being that the Negroes of the Americas and Caribbean are also carriers of this same gene and sub-branches of it, we know that they are related to the Bantu, Niger-Congo, Kordofania Negroes of the West African and Benue areas. These areas, from which the vast majority of the slaves of the transatlantic slave trade were gathered from, were both smaller parts of a greater territory known as Negroland. Quito was not only the portal and location of some of the highest concentrations of individuals with haplogroup E1B1A DNA, but it is also the home of Voodoo. This is what repelled the spirit of Yahuwah, our God, and opened the door for our enemies to enslave our African ancestors. Due to a copyright strike, I could not include the video talking about Voodoo in Benin. However, I will share the link of the video in the description box. Because of this Voodoo, the Most High allowed the nations to enslave the Israelites as prophesied in Deuteronomy 28. The Gentiles were allowed as the same Voodoo on the Israelites that the created. Here in South Africa, we have many problems we are faced with. For example, high levels of gender-based violence, high levels of rape and child abuse. Many people are living with a mental illness, depression, poverty, and there's people in miserable marriages, abusive relationships. Women go through the trauma of having a miscarriage, high crime rates, and the list goes on. I will mention this again. These problems are curses, and they all have a start to them. We've discussed the curses written in the book of Deuteronomy, and we've also discussed how the Christian religion is false. Now we have to discuss the other form of idolatry keeping us cursed. This idolatry is African spirituality, whether it be the appeasing of ancestors, water spirits, belief in animism, and voodoo. This revelation is not trying to demonize what we believe in as Africans. It is rather an attempt to shine light on what African spirituality truly is about. Depending on which country you are as a black person, the form of African spirituality you follow differs. We are in South Africa, so we follow the form of African spirituality, which is ancestor worship and belief in animism. In simple terms, the belief that ancestors can come back in the form of an animal. Now we were able to identify who we are as people from the Bantu category. We are the children of the Hebrews, not the Egyptians. The Hebrews only served one God, and that God is Yahweh, who actually has many other names. What happened is that the Hebrews started to move from where they lived to other locations. When they arrived in those other locations, which already had people living in them, then the Hebrews started to spend time with those people, and unfortunately for them, those people didn't know and serve the same God of the Hebrews. They only knew their own gods. While the Hebrews were spending time with the indigenous people of the location they migrated to, they started to participate in the worship of unknown gods. So for us today to be strictly following African spirituality, it is because this is a practice our ancestors learned from other nations. It was never truly their way of life. These other non-Hebrew nations spoken about are the ancient Egyptians, the Canaanites, and other nations the Hebrews mingled with. It is rumored that Khoi and San people are the modern Canaanites. However, proper research has not been done to confirm this. The true owners of the African spirituality are the children of the Egyptians, and another part of it was influenced by the Canaanites. Now this is where the video is going to get highly offensive and hurt your emotions badly. We are going to start with the reason why we are so afraid of not appeasing the ancestors. Our strong obedience to ancestor spirits is based on fear. We are scared of losing what is important to us and falling sick with diseases or complications that the doctors cannot explain. We have witnessed how things turned out for people who didn't want to honor their ancestors. Now we are going to tap into the spiritual world. Have you ever experienced something called sleep paralysis, where you were lying frozen on your bed while you were sleeping? You couldn't move and you couldn't speak. You could only move your eyes around and say a prayer in your mind. When this was happening, you saw these shadowy spirits that were looking at you or doing something to you. Another event may be that you felt something heavy on your chest, or you saw a witch during that state of being frozen. Well, during that state of sleep, your spirit is wide awake and it can see and sense everything that exists around it, including those shadowy spirits. Since you are still alive, you cannot move your spirit because it is still bound to your body. So what I'm trying to get out of this is that you are alone, and you are surrounded by these scary dark spirits. You don't have any angelic spirit come to your rescue. Neither do you have any ancestor present with you in this horrific time. Many of us have experienced sleep paralysis, and I'm sure all of us have never had the miracle of an ancestor rescuing us from these scary spirits. So what this means is that all along we were taught that our ancestors are with us everywhere we go. They are watching over us, and they are our guardian angels. But when we are actually in a state of being awake spiritually and being able to see spirits, we never see any of them. This leads to us discussing the topic of who ancestors really are. As Black people, we all know how tough life is for us. Our parents know how tough life is, and our grandparents also lived through tough times. For the past 200 years, those who lived before us were suffering just as much as we are suffering right now. Here's something to think about. If your grandparents lived their lives in misery, wouldn't they want you as their future generation to have a much better life than them? When any ancestor of yours was still alive, how do you remember them to be? Of course, there are some nice people and there's some mean people, but let's use the ancestor who was a nice person when they were still alive. If that ancestor was loving towards you, what would make them suddenly become mean after they die and bring you even more pain and suffering when you're already living a tough life? And they do this just for a blood or animal sacrifice. Do you remember a day when they were still alive where they requested blood because they were hungry or thirsty? I don't think that has happened to me. I don't know about you. We are told that our ancestors are our guardian angels, right? So when unfortunate things like gender-based violence or sexual abuse happen to us, where are those guardian angels? When we are getting robbed, why don't those guardian angels protect us? When the oppressors were doing all the bad that they were doing to us, why didn't our ancestors fight for us? Ladies and gents, we already have Yahweh's back turned on us, and even in our Creator's anger, He actually tells us to cry out to these gods we have abandoned Him for, and let them rescue us in our times of hardships. We respect the spirits of ancestors, right? When they demand a goat or chicken sacrifice, we bring it to them. When they demand a ceremony, we do one for them. When they demand food and drinks, we give it to them. We do our best to make sure they don't feel abandoned. And with the amount of dedication we have towards ancestors, they should do something big to reward us, but they don't. Many young people wish to be independent and start having their own income, but sadly, their lives are not heading anywhere at all. Nothing good is coming their way. And the only thing you can ask yourself now is, are these spirits who always demand things from me really my ancestors? Which will now take us to discussing the forbidden knowledge of the spiritual world. And we're going to start talking about the world of ancestors by strictly looking at what the prophets of ancestors do. I'm sure many of us have seen how the prophets of ancestors go to the water to honor the spirits of the water. We as the public also get taken to the water in order to be cleansed of bad luck by these prophets. Now we are going to take a look at Sangoma art to see how they express their experiences underwater or in the spiritual world. If we look at these two images, you can see giant snakes, and it appears as if these two ladies are comfortable with these snakes. We are told that ancestors can come back in various different forms. For example, they can come back as snakes or praying mantises or whichever other animal. And this is the animism part of African spirituality. Remember earlier that we mentioned how we never see angelic presences or ancestors during sleep paralysis? That is one of the signs that our ancestors are not present with us at all. Yes, it is possible for the ghost of a dead relative to be trapped in this world, but that is only due to a few reasons, with one reason being that they don't know they died or they had a horrific death. To be 100% sure that these spirits who claim to be our ancestors or who claim to be present with us through animals are really our ancestors, we have to compare what they did when they were still alive with what they do now that they have passed on. When your grandparents were still alive, did they ever have the power to paralyze you and stop you from being able to walk just because you didn't listen to them that one time? When any dead relative of yours was still alive, let's say you are in the car with them and they are driving, if you didn't respond to them when they were talking to you, did they crash the car on purpose so that you can learn a lesson for not responding to them? On which day did your uncle or auntie make you sick just because you stopped communicating to them or visiting them? If they never did these things when they were still alive, what makes them change and be very harsh to you after they died? When your grandparents were still alive and they were hungry, did they ever request blood to eat so they can get full? Do you yourself ever crave chicken blood when you are thirsty or hungry? If you have children, what is your greatest wish for them? Is it not for them to prosper in the future and live a life that has more opportunities than yours? If you love your children, do you ever do any horrific things to them because they don't talk to you? What would make you suddenly change after you die and become this mean person to people you once loved? All in the name of animal sacrifices. You can pause the video and think about this. To expose the spiritual world, you and I are going to take a trip to another world within this one, where the prophets of ancestors go to meet with the spirits pretending to be ancestors. To remove any confusion, I am going to continue referring to this other world as the ancestral world, and I'm going to continue referring to these water spirits as ancestors, even though they are. Every body of water has a portal opening to another world where these water spirits are completely visible. These bodies of water can be rivers, dams, oceans, ponds, or whatever else. The prophets of ancestors know who they are communicating with when they are on the surface of the water and doing sacrifices. Let's now reveal a graphic representation of the ancestral or underwater spirit world. I want to specify that the ancestral or underwater world is not the same as the one we are living in. It's another world existing within this one. It's a spiritual world which you can only go to in your spirit form. Here you find the water spirits. Although you see the spirits in the water, the ancestral world is actually dry. You won't feel the feeling of water even though you are in the water. There's a giant snake that stays in one place And then there's mermaids who stay with it. Yes, mermaids do exist, but they are spirits. The mermaids are like the assistants of this big snake. This is just one part of this world. There's many other locations in this underwater world, which are filled with other large snakes. And then there's also locations where the people who drowned or who died in the water are trapped in. Some prophets of ancestors do report seeing their ancestors with the giant snake, or they are told that the ancestors are living in this giant snake. Of course, we are all being deceived by these spirits, including the prophets who work for them. Another high-rank spirit that operates in this spirit world is Baal. Out of all of the spirits who hide behind the ancestor term, Baal and his agents are also involved.
Who is Baal and what are some of his other names?
Baal was a Canaanite god or idol who is also known as Molech, Baal, Baphomet. Baal works with Ra, the sun god. Large amounts of people, or let me rather say our ancestors, used to pray to this idol, which had the head of a calf and was made of brass. It was empty inside, and there was space on its side or the front to make a fire in it. When the fireplace got very hot, the wicked people would go and put their newborns or babies in the arms of the idol. Afterwards, the baby would be transferred into the hot fireplace, where it would burn to death. While this was happening, there were men who were blowing trumpets and beating drums to make a loud noise that would mask the sound of the baby who was crying in pain. This is how one of the sacrificial processes of Baal took place. Baal was known to be a rider of clouds, most active during storms, but was also considered to be a lord of heaven and earth, even controlling Earth's fertility. He was the god of thunderstorms, the most vigorous and aggressive of the gods, and the one on whom mortals most depended on. Here is another way Baal appears. Looking at this other way he shows up, we can see how his spirit is still with the Hebrews even outside of Canaan or Israel. Baal is also a god of war. If you look at him here, he is holding weapons, which were used by African warriors throughout history. One weapon being the knobkerrie or club, and the other weapon being a spear. If you look at this picture, you can see the heads of two bulls or cows on the top. You see this version of Baal fighting someone holding something known as a knobkerrie in South Africa. Beneath him are the corpses of two men who were conquered to death. Baal also works with human sacrifice. If you know of anyone, whether a baby or adult, who died before the ages of 70 or 80, which is the lifespan Yahweh gives to the current generations as written in Psalm 90 verse 10, then it is highly possible that this was the spirit of Baal collecting his human sacrifice.
How was Baal worshipped?
One of the ways Baal was worshipped was through sex orgies. People would worship an idol, which was in the shape of an enlarged male sex organ, and Asherah. Temple prostitutes supported the temple worship of Baal. Its worship was filled with perversion, homosexuality, immorality, and sexual promiscuity. Another way to worship Baal was through child sacrifice, sexual immorality, which included both heterosexual and homosexual acts, and pantheism, which is showing deep respect to creation more than the creator himself. Ritualistic Baal worship looked like this. Adults would gather around the altar of Baal. Infants would then be burned alive as a sacrificial offering to the deity. Amid horrific screams and the stench of charred human flesh, congregants, men and women alike, would engage in bisexual orgies.
Besides child sacrifice, what else was sacrificed to Baal?
Baal's worshippers appeased him by offering sacrifices, usually animals such as sheep or bulls, which is something that we are still doing in this present day. We know this sacrificial ceremony as thanking the ancestors for the good that they have done in our lives, when in fact it is still the very same practices taken to worship Baal, just like how the Hebrews did in ancient times.
What are the customs followed when worshiping Baal?
After we sacrifice a cow or goat in a ceremony, the skull or horns of these animals are placed on the rooftop of a house or displayed on the entrance. This is said to symbolize obedience on part of the family when someone from the family had a visitation or vision from the ancestors. 1 Kings chapter 17 verse 20 says, "So they cried aloud and cut themselves, as was their custom, with knives and lances, until the blood gushed out on them. Leviticus chapter 17 verse 11 says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement or payment for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement or payment for the soul." The book of Jubilees chapter 21 verse 18 says, "And do not eat any blood, for it is the soul. Eat no blood whatever." As we have read from here, the act of cutting yourself as part of a cultural tradition is actually a spiritual transfer of your bloodline or soul to Baal and all other spirits who hide behind the name ancestors or the dead. This means that black people are spiritually owned by Baal and all the other spirits he works with, because our ancestors did get incisions on their bodies, and in other cases they sacrificed their children to him. No matter what you were told the cultural cutting tradition was for, it is still a spiritual transfer onto ungodly spirits. Now that we understand what Baal worship is about, let's read Jeremiah chapter 11 verses 11 to 14. 11 Therefore thus says the Lord, Behold, I will surely bring calamity on them which they will not be able to escape, and though they cry out to me, I will not listen to them. 12 Then the cities of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem will go and cry out to the gods to whom they offer incense, but they will not save them at all in the time of their trouble. 13 For according to the number of your cities were your gods, O Judah, and according to the number of the streets of Jerusalem you have set up altars to that shameful thing, altars to burn incense to Baal. 14 So do not pray for this people or lift up a cry or prayer for them, for I will not hear them in the time that they cry out to me because of their trouble. Judea, presently known as Palestine, is where our ancestors originated from. It is our homeland. To further prove that we are the true descendants or children of the Jews/Hebrews who fled Judea during the massive slaughtering of Jews by the Romans around year 70 AD, we will look at Nubian customs and compare them with how they show up in each of our cultures. We now know that Nubians are Hebrews, and Europeans rename the Hebrews to that name because they wanted to get rid of the name of Israel. However, the present-day Nubians are actually the children of the ancient Egyptians, not the Israelites. You can see that they don't even look like us or the ancient Nubians who were actually Hebrews. If you look at these paintings of Jews or Hebrews, you can see them wearing white garments with black stripes. There is a southern Bantu tribe that has a traditional attire that resembles that of the ancient Jews. This ancient Jewish attire is also worn by the false Jews. In the book of Revelations chapter 2 verse 9, the Messiah says, I know your works, tribulation, and poverty, but you are rich. And I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. And again in Revelation chapter 3 verse 9 it says, Indeed I will make those of the synagogue of Satan, who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. Indeed I will make them come and worship before your feet, and to know that I have loved you. These two verses, Revelations 2 verse 9 and 3 verse 9, tell us that those that are currently known as Jews are not the real children of Israel. The ancient Jews used to have artistic drawings or paintings on their houses, as you can see over here. Over here we have a southern Bantu house that has artistic drawings or paintings on it. If we look at their crafts, the ancient Jews also used to make items like these. Again, you can find these very same items made from this kind of material in southern Bantu tribes. Now that we have full confidence that we are the descendants of the ancient Jews who left their homeland due to Roman persecution, and we also have a small understanding about Baal, we are going to talk about some of the things that are happening to us or happened to our ancestors who lived before us. The first thing is miscarriage and womb-related issues. Initially, when our ancestors first worshipped Baal on the earth, they sacrificed their firstborn babies to him just like how we sacrifice chickens, goats, and cows to the spirits who claim to be our ancestors. Remember earlier I mentioned that Ra works together with Baal? Well, It was a normal thing in those times for Baal or Ra to receive child sacrifices, and this practice is the reason why millions of black women have had miscarriages or have an inability to conceive. Therefore, it is highly possible that for thousands of years of women in your bloodline miscarrying their babies, it was an involuntary sacrifice to Baal which your foremothers and forefathers started by allowing their firstborn babies to be burnt to death as a ritual. Another form of sacrifice to Baal is human sacrifice. Have you ever lost a loved one before they reached their old age? I think it's safe to say that many of us have, and who do we blame when that happens? We go straight to blaming God Yahweh. Yes, we are all guilty of doing that, but we forget that none of us have been worshiping Him in spirit and in truth. Yahweh actually has nothing to do with any difficulties in our life. Remember that we and our ancestors haven't been truly seeking Him. We are now going to speak of the problems we all experience as the Bantu nation, or as black people all over the world. Over here it says Baal has a lot to do with the transference of wealth, hindrances or difficulty to obtaining land, confinement, containment. In other words, feeling like a prisoner in any country where you live in, and great resistance to destiny. Transference of wealth. Wealth being in the form of inheritance. Much of these problems are listed in the curses of Deuteronomy 28. No matter what method you try in order to gain wealth, there will always be something that will happen to stop your attempts to gain wealth or financial freedom. We mentioned that some people only manage to get wealthy by shedding something or someone's blood frequently and selling their souls. But for us who'd rather not take that route, things are really tough for us. We can invest our money, and the investment firms will collapse, causing us to lose all our funds. We can try investing in agriculture, and again something will sabotage that investment. We can join stockfuls and our monies disappear or get stolen. I'm sure many have experienced difficulty in trying to gain wealth. These are just one of the hardships that come with worshiping Baal, who hides behind the term ancestors. Hindrances or difficulty to obtaining land. When the Europeans arrived in Africa, they stole or hijacked the land from the natives. The Khosans and Banta had their land taken away from them. Again, this is one of the curses listed in Deuteronomy 28. This is just one of those hardships that come with worshiping Baal, who hides behind the term ancestors. Confinement/containment. Let's first define confinement. Confinement is another word for imprisonment, which is the state of being in prison, captivity. Being under captivity is to be taken prisoner, when your ability to move or act freely is limited by being kept in a space. How are we imprisoned, you may wonder? We are imprisoned by the money system. Does anyone have the freedom to not go to work for a month for absolutely no reason? Do we have the freedom to wake up at 10 a.m. and arrive at work at 12? Do we have the freedom to take a half day just because we don't feel like staying for the rest of the day? The answers to those questions are all no. Our whole lives depend on our jobs, and that is how we are being held captive. Remember the quote made by John Adams that there are two ways to conquer and enslave a nation. One is by the sword. The other is by debt. The other form of imprisonment is the one that happened during apartheid. If you didn't have your pass or ID book at a whites-only area, as a person of color, you got taken to jail for that. There were some people who also got taken to jail for protesting against apartheid. And lastly, imprisonment through slavery. We lost a large portion of our relatives during the transatlantic slave trade and East African slave trade too. This is all due to the spirit of Baal, who hides behind the term ancestors. Woman abuse and child abuse also fall under this confinement. Great resistance to destiny. Resistance is the refusal of something from happening, or in simple words, not succeeding. Destiny is defined as the events that will necessarily happen to a particular person or thing in the future. Destiny is your future or purpose. Every single one of us in this world has a purpose. If we turn to the book written by prophet Jeremiah on chapter 29 verse 11, Yahweh says, "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says Yahweh, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. Now this is evidence that our God in heaven, Yahweh, doesn't want us to suffer. Like how we are right now, He wants to take us out of the hardships we are faced with. But there's a huge blockage stopping that from happening. That blockage being the spirits of Baal, Ra, Leviathan, marine spirits, and all other ungodly spirits who hide behind the name ancestors. For over 3,000 years, us and our ancestors have carried the Egyptian and Canaanite traditions of making covenants with spirits we know to be ancestors, when in fact it's all sorts of different evil spirits hiding behind that name. So these are the worthless gods we have been worshiping for centuries that Yahweh, our Creator, hates with passion. We have chosen to show respect to these spirits and not to Yahweh, and that is the reason why we are all living a miserable life. Isaiah 24 verse 5 to 6 says the people have defiled the earth by breaking Yahweh's laws and by violating the covenant He made to last forever. So Yahweh has pronounced a curse on the earth. Its people are paying for what they have done. Fewer and fewer remain alive. The spirits or creatures we serve do not have any good plan for us. They are working against us, and they want us to live horrible lives. These spirits are Yahweh's enemies, and the Christian and Islamic religion is also part of this. Yahweh gave us the opportunity to reunite with Him in spirit by giving up His one and only begotten Son, Yahshua HaMashiach. Jesus Christ is His English name or translated name, and it still makes demons shake in fear. Yahweh never gave us images and wooden statues to worship in place of Him as written in Deuteronomy 12 verses 3 through 4. For over 2,000 years, we have been cut off from Yahweh, the God of us Hebrews. There's a saying that is found in the book of Isaiah chapter 8 verse 20. It says, "To the law and to the testimony, if they do not speak according to this word, it is because there is no light in them." The doctrines of men taught in the false church along with African spirituality are the two ways we are separated from Yahweh our God. It's time for us as Yahuwah's people to come out of this spiritual and physical oppression. Yahweh wants His people back, and the lives we are living today weren't supposed to turn out the way they did. We are suffering for the sins of our ancestors and our own sins. And so the blame for all this pain goes to our ancestors who decided to follow other gods and pass these foreign traditions to their children. Baruch 8 verse 13 says, "If you had walked in the way of God Yahweh, you would be living in peace forever." For us to fix our mistakes, we will now have to go on a continuous journey of breaking curses and becoming the people that Yahweh designed us to be. And fortunately for us, there is an online deliverance school that offers courses that teach powerful curse-breaking techniques. Feel free to check out Breaking Curses 101 here on Facebook or search for their website on Google. It is the wish of every parent for their children to prosper and achieve better things in life. But this can only be possible if you, as the parent, remove any curses on you, since the law of Yahweh states that the sins of the parents fall on the children. And the first step one and take to remove the evil spirits over your life and children's life is to try deliverance out. A big thank you goes to Arya Nasi Research, Breaking Curses 101, and Set for a Reset, Set Hey, for revealing this information.